The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Aida Martinez rolled out of bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades waking up in unfamiliar places, ready to chase stories across war-torn landscapes. Now, at 48, her battlefield was the peaceful streets of Millbrook, population 3,247, where the most dangerous thing she encountered was Mrs. Peterson's overly enthusiastic golden retriever. The morning sun painted the streets of Millbrook in soft golden light as Aida loaded her delivery van with packages. The routine had become second nature. Sort by address, plan the most efficient route, check for special delivery instructions. It was a far cry from her days as a war correspondent, when she never knew if she'd make it through the day alive. Her small apartment above Chen's coffee shop was spartanly furnished but comfortable. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph from her journalism days, a group of refugees she had helped evacuate from a conflict zone. It served as a reminder of why she had chosen this quieter life and why sometimes the most important work happened away from the spotlight. "Morning, Aida," called Mrs. Henderson from her flower shop as she unlocked her doors. "Got my seeds today?" "Right here," Aida smiled, handing over the small package. "From that specialty company in Oregon, just like you ordered. These should give you beautiful sunflowers by midsummer." Mrs. Henderson had been one of the first people to welcome Aida to Millbrook. The elderly woman had a gift for making everyone feel at home, and her flower shop served as an unofficial community center where people gathered to share news and gossip. "How are you settling in, dear? Still missing the excitement of your old job?" Aida considered the question as she organized the remaining packages in her van. "Some days I miss the adrenaline," she admitted. "But there's something to be said for knowing that everyone you deliver to will still be here tomorrow." This was her routine now. Simple deliveries to familiar faces. Mr. Chen needed his weekly supply of specialty coffee beans. Dr. Santos expected medical journals and supplies for her clinic. The elementary school was always excited about book deliveries and educational materials. No bombs, no gunfire, no desperate people fleeing their homes. Just peaceful Millbrook, where the biggest news was usually about the annual pie contest or road construction delays. But as Aida continued her route that Tuesday morning, something felt different. 2 men in expensive suits stood outside the town's only bank, talking quietly. Their conversation seemed intense, with lots of pointing and gesturing toward different buildings around the town square. They didn't look like locals. Their city clothes and serious expressions seemed out of place in laid-back Millbrook, where most people wore jeans and knew each other by name. She made a mental note, filing the observation away with the automatic precision of someone trained to notice details. Old habits from her journalism days never died, and something about the strangers triggered the instincts that had kept her alive in dangerous places. The Bank of Millbrook was a small, single-story building that had served the community for over 50 years. Most transactions were simple: farmers depositing checks, families taking out small loans for home improvements, elderly residents managing their savings. The presence of 2 obvious outsiders discussing something serious enough to require suits and briefcases seemed unusual. As she continued her deliveries, Aida found herself paying more attention to her surroundings than she had in months. The journalist in her was waking up, sensing a story even if she couldn't yet identify what it might be. Over the next few days, Aida noticed more strangers around town. They appeared at different locations, outside the post office near Murphy's Diner, walking past the small businesses on Main Street, always well-dressed, always watching, always taking notes or photos with expensive-looking cameras and phones. "Who are those men?" asked Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley's hardware store, as Aida delivered his monthly supply order. Tom was a third-generation Millbrook resident whose family had run the hardware store since the 1940s. He knew everyone in town and was genuinely puzzled by the newcomers. "I'm not sure," she replied, but her journalist instincts were already working. "Have they talked to you?" Tom shook his head nervously, wiping his hands on his work apron. "No, but they were here yesterday, looking around, measuring things with some kind of electronic device. Made me uncomfortable. They didn't buy anything, didn't really ask questions about the business, just observed, like they were evaluating something." Ada had seen that look before, in her reporting days, when people sensed danger but couldn't name it yet. During her years covering conflicts, she had learned to recognize the subtle signs of communities under threat. The nervousness in people's voices, the way they looked over their shoulders, the tendency to speak in whispers about things that should be discussed openly. Did they say what they were interested in? "That's the strange part," Tom continued, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the store. "They seemed more interested in the building than the business. Asked about when it was built, whether I owned or rented, how much foot traffic we get. Business questions, but not the kind you'd ask if you were planning to shop here." That afternoon, she saw one of the strangers talking to Mayor Peterson outside the town hall. The conversation looked serious, with lots of hand gestures and pointing toward the business district. The mayor nodded frequently, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook. When the stranger left, Peterson stood there for several minutes, looking troubled and repeatedly checking his watch. Something was definitely happening in Millbrook, and Ada's instincts told her it wasn't something good. She decided to extend her delivery route slightly, taking a longer path that would allow her to observe more of the town's daily activities. As a delivery driver, she had the perfect cover for being everywhere and talking to everyone without raising suspicion. That evening, she sat in her apartment reviewing the day's observations. 3 strangers, all well-dressed and professional-looking. Interest in buildings and businesses rather than goods or services. Meetings with local officials. Systematic documentation of locations and activities. It reminded her of preliminary research for a military operation, but instead of targeting enemy positions, these people seemed to be mapping Millbrook itself. Ada began carrying a small notebook during her deliveries, something she hadn't done since leaving journalism. She wrote down license plate numbers of unfamiliar cars, noted which businesses the strangers visited, and recorded times and dates of their activities. The notebook felt familiar in her hands, bringing back memories of countless interviews and investigations. The strangers seemed particularly interested in certain buildings. The old movie theater that had been closed for years after the owners retired, the empty lot where Peterson's department store used to be, before it closed due to competition from larger stores in nearby cities, and several small shops that struggled to stay profitable in an economy that increasingly favored online shopping over local businesses. "They asked about buying my place," whispered Sarah Chen, who ran the town's only bookstore. Sarah was Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, a quiet woman in her 30s who had taken over the struggling bookstore when her husband's mother retired. "Offered way more money than it's worth. But I don't want to sell. This store belonged to my grandmother-in-law, and it's one of the few places in town where people still gather to talk about books and ideas." "Did they say what they wanted it for?" Ada asked, genuinely curious. "Some kind of development project. They mentioned bringing new opportunities to Millbrook and talked about modernizing the downtown area." Sarah looked worried, absently straightening books on a nearby shelf. "But they weren't very specific about what kind of opportunities or what modernizing would mean for existing businesses." The bookstore was small but cozy, with comfortable reading chairs and a coffee station that encouraged people to browse and stay. It was exactly the kind of local business that gave small towns their character, but also the kind that struggled to compete with online retailers and chain stores. "What did you tell them?" "That I wasn't interested in selling. They were polite about it, but I got the feeling they didn't really expect me to refuse. Like they were going through the motions of asking rather than actually negotiating." That evening, Ada sat in her apartment spreading out her notes on the small dining table. patterns were emerging. The strangers were systematically visiting businesses that were either struggling financially or located in prime spots along Main Street. They offered quick sales at high prices, but when owners asked questions about their plans, they became vague and evasive. This reminded her of stories she had covered about corporate land grabs in developing countries, but something felt more sinister here. Corporate developers usually had detailed presentations about their plans, architectural drawings, timelines, and public relations campaigns to win community support. These people operated more like intelligence agents conducting reconnaissance. She opened her laptop and began researching the license plates she had recorded. 2 of the cars were rentals from companies in the state capital about 2 hours away. The third was registered to a limited liability company with an address that, when she looked it up on mapping software, appeared to be an empty office building. Her journalist training told her to dig deeper. Using skills learned during years of investigative reporting, Aida began researching online. She looked up the license plates she had recorded, traced them to rental companies in the state capital. The men were using fake names, but their credit cards showed interesting patterns when she cross-referenced them with public databases and social media platforms. Late one night, using the coffee shop's internet connection, she discovered that similar mysterious buyers had appeared in 3 other small towns across the state over the past 2 years. In each case, they had purchased multiple properties quickly, then converted them into fronts for businesses that barely operated but showed large profits on paper according to state business registration records. The pattern was classic money laundering. She had seen it before in her international reporting. Criminal organizations buying legitimate businesses to clean dirty money through fake transactions. The process involved purchasing real estate or businesses, then creating false revenue streams that justified moving large amounts of cash through the legitimate banking system. But this was Millbrook, not some war-torn country or major city where criminal organizations typically operated. Why would organized crime be interested in a peaceful small town where everyone knew their neighbors and the biggest law enforcement presence was a single police chief and 2 part-time officers? The answer came to her gradually as she continued her research. Small towns had less oversight, fewer questions, and officials who might be more easily influenced or corrupted. Perfect for cleaning large amounts of illegal money without attracting federal attention. Rural areas also offered easier access to transportation networks, highways, railways, and small airports that could move goods without the security measures found in major cities. She found news articles about similar operations in other states, where criminal organizations had taken over small towns by systematically purchasing key properties and corrupting local officials. Once they controlled the local government and business infrastructure, they used these towns as hubs for money laundering, drug distribution, and human trafficking. The realization that Millbrook might be targeted for such activities sent a chill through her. This wasn't just about real estate development or economic opportunity. This was about criminals taking over her adopted hometown and turning it into a base for illegal operations. She needed more information, but she also needed to be careful. If these people were truly connected to organized crime, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation. Aida's suspicions about Mayor Peterson grew when she noticed him meeting regularly with the strangers. During her morning delivery route, she often saw him at unusual places: the old gas station on the edge of town that had been closed for months, the abandoned warehouse district near the railway tracks, locations where he had no obvious business as mayor of a small town. Peterson had been mayor for 8 years, ever since retiring from his job as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company. He was generally well-liked, known for keeping taxes low and maintaining town services efficiently. But lately, he seemed nervous and distracted during town council meetings, and several residents had commented that he appeared to be under stress. One day, she followed him discreetly after finishing her deliveries. Peterson drove to a fancy restaurant 30 miles away where he met with 3 of the strangers and a woman Aida didn't recognize. Through the restaurant window, she watched them exchange documents and shake hands. The meeting lasted over 2 hours, with the conversation appearing intense and serious. She took photos with her phone, being careful not to be seen. The woman appeared to be in charge, directing the conversation while the men took notes. Peterson looked nervous, but seemed to agree with whatever they were discussing. At one point, he handed over what looked like official documents, possibly related to town business or property records. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place that required reservations and served expensive wine. Not somewhere a small-town mayor would typically meet with legitimate business developers, especially without including other town officials or holding the meeting in a public venue where citizens could observe. Later that week, Peterson announced at the town council meeting that Millbrook had received an offer from a development company interested in revitalizing the downtown area. He recommended that the town accept their proposals for economic growth and job creation, presenting the opportunity as a chance to bring prosperity to a community that had struggled economically for years. Aida attended the meeting, listening carefully as Peterson avoided specific questions about the company's background or their exact plans. Several business owners expressed concerns about what development would mean for existing shops and services, but Peterson assured them everything was legal and beneficial for the community. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity Millbrook needs," he said, reading from prepared notes rather than speaking naturally. "These developers have experience revitalizing small towns across the region. They're offering to invest significant capital in our community, create jobs, and help us compete with larger cities for residents and businesses." When pressed for details about the company's previous projects or their specific plans for Millbrook, Peterson promised to provide more information at future meetings. But Aida noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with questions and eager to move on to other topics. That night, she knew she had to dig deeper. The pieces were coming together to form a picture she didn't like, but she needed solid evidence before taking any action. Drawing on investigative techniques from her journalism career, Aida began building a comprehensive case. She documented every interaction between the strangers and local officials, photographed their meetings when possible, and researched the shell companies they claimed to represent. Her breakthrough came when she noticed that several businesses in town had already changed ownership on paper, even though they continued operating normally. The new owners were limited liability companies with addresses that led to empty offices in the state capital or post office boxes in different states. She spent hours in the town hall reviewing public records, using her charm and professional demeanor to gain access to documents that were technically public, but rarely examined by citizens. The clerk, an elderly woman named Betty, who had worked there for 30 years, was happy to help someone who showed genuine interest in local government. "Most people never bother to look at these records," Betty said, pulling out filing cabinets full of property deeds and business registrations. "It's nice to see someone taking an interest in how the town operates." The records revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 6 months, 6 different businesses had been sold to companies with names like Regional Development Solutions, LLC, and Mountain States Investment Group. The sales prices were significantly higher than market value, and the buyers had paid in cash, which was unusual for commercial real estate transactions. She also discovered that large cash deposits had been made to accounts associated with these businesses, far more money than these small shops could realistically generate. Murphy's Diner, for example, now showed monthly revenues of $50,000 according to tax filings, despite serving a customer base that couldn't possibly support such income. The pattern was classic money laundering, creating false revenue streams to justify moving illegal funds into the legitimate banking system. The criminals would show fake customers making large purchases, then use those transactions to explain why so much cash was flowing through otherwise modest businesses. But gathering evidence was dangerous. If these people were truly connected to organized crime, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation. Aida had covered enough criminal investigations to know that witnesses and journalists who got too close to organized crime operations often faced intimidation, violence, or worse. She began varying her delivery routes, taking photos from different angles, and always ensuring she had witnesses nearby when documenting suspicious activities. She also started making copies of all her evidence, storing them in multiple locations, including a safe deposit box in the next town, and encrypted files uploaded to secure cloud storage services. Her apartment became a makeshift investigation headquarters, with documents spread across her dining table and a detailed timeline posted on the wall. She felt like she was back in her journalism days, pursuing a story that could have significant impact on people's lives. One afternoon, while delivering packages near the old movie theater, Aida overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. Two of the strangers were discussing dealing with problems in a way that clearly suggested violence was an option they were prepared to use. If people won't cooperate voluntarily, we have other methods of persuasion, one said in a low voice that carried just far enough for her to hear. The boss wants this wrapped up quickly, replied the other. Too much attention from outsiders isn't good for business. We need to move to the next phase before anyone starts asking difficult questions. They were standing near her delivery van, apparently unaware that she was close enough to overhear their conversation. She pretended to organize packages while listening to as much as possible. What about the bookstore woman? She's still refusing to sell. We'll increase the pressure. Maybe some problems with her utilities, issues with her business license, health department complaints. Nothing too obvious, but enough to make her reconsider. And if that doesn't work, then we escalate. But let's try the soft approach first. Less attention from law enforcement that way. They noticed Aida nearby and stopped talking. One of them approached her, a tall man with cold eyes and an expensive suit that looked out of place in small-town Millbrook. You're the delivery woman, right? Aida something? Yes, just doing my job, she replied calmly, though her heart was racing. She forced herself to maintain normal body language, continuing to sort packages as if their conversation hadn't alarmed her. You seem to be around a lot. Always watching, always listening. Maybe you should focus more on your packages and less on other people's business. The threat was clear, but delivered with a smile that made it even more unsettling. This was someone accustomed to intimidating people. Someone who knew how to deliver warnings that couldn't be reported to police as explicit threats. I'm just trying to do good work for my customers. Nothing more, she responded, meeting his gaze directly. Years of interviewing dangerous people in conflict zones had taught her that showing fear often made situations worse. I'm sure you are. Just remember that some conversations aren't meant for outsiders. People who mind their own business tend to live longer, healthier lives. After they walked away, she realized her investigation had been noticed. These weren't amateur criminals making mistakes that would be easy to expose. They were professionals who paid attention to potential threats and dealt with them systematically. She would have to be much more careful, but she couldn't stop now. Too many people in Millbrook were at risk, and she might be the only person in a position to expose what was happening before it was too late. Over the following weeks, Aida discovered that the criminal operation was larger and more sophisticated than she had initially thought. They weren't just laundering money. They were planning to use Millbrook as a distribution hub for illegal activities across the entire region. The location was perfect for their needs, small enough to avoid federal attention, but close enough to major highways for easy transportation of goods and people. By controlling key properties and local officials, they could operate with minimal interference from law enforcement. She documented payments being made to several town officials beyond the mayor. Police Chief Williams had received a new car, officially described as a community donation, but clearly beyond what a police chief's salary could afford. He also suddenly began taking expensive vacations to places like Las Vegas and Miami, trips that seemed inconsistent with his previous lifestyle. The building inspector, Robert Hayes, had started approving construction permits without proper reviews, allowing work to proceed on buildings that would normally require extensive safety checks. His own home had recently undergone expensive renovations despite his modest municipal salary. Even some members of the town council seemed to have new sources of income. Councilwoman Janet Miller, who ran a struggling insurance office, suddenly had enough money to expand her business and hire additional staff. Councilman Dave Thompson, a retired teacher living on a pension, purchased a new truck and began talking about investing in rental properties. The corruption was systematic and well organized. These weren't amateur criminals making random attempts to buy influence. They were professionals with experience in taking over small communities through a combination of legitimate-seeming business deals and carefully targeted corruption of key officials. But Aida also identified potential allies. Several business owners remained resistant to selling their properties, and a few town council members continued asking difficult questions despite pressure to stay quiet. Dr. Maria Santos, who ran the town's medical clinic, had been asking pointed questions about the development proposals during town council meetings. She seemed genuinely concerned about how rapid development might affect the community's character and quality of life. Tom Bradley continued to resist pressure to sell his hardware store, despite increasingly attractive offers. He had deep roots in the community and genuine concern for its future. Sarah Chen at the bookstore was also holding out, though Aida could see the stress was taking a toll on her. The subtle intimidation tactics the criminals were using, unexpected visits from building inspectors, problems with utility services, anonymous complaints about her business, were designed to wear down resistance over time. She began reaching out carefully to these people, testing their willingness to stand up to the criminal organization and gauging whether they could be trusted with sensitive information. "I know something strange is happening," said Dr. Maria Santos when Aida approached her carefully at the medical clinic. "Patients are afraid to talk about the new people in town. Some have been threatened for asking questions, though they won't give me details about what kind of threats." Aida had approached the doctor carefully, knowing that medical professionals often saw patterns that others missed, and that their professional obligation to maintain patient confidentiality made them safer repositories for sensitive information. Dr. Santos was a respected member of the community who had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier to take over from the retiring doctor who had served the town for decades. She was known for her competence, compassion, and willingness to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay. "What kind of things are people saying?" Aida asked. "Increased anxiety, stress-related symptoms, people mentioning pressure to make decisions about their businesses or properties. Several patients have asked me about anxiety medication, which is unusual for this community. People here typically handle stress through family support and community connections, not prescription drugs." The doctor had noticed that several business owners seemed particularly stressed, with symptoms consistent with people facing significant external pressure. Some had mentioned sleep problems, others complained of headaches and digestive issues that often accompanied prolonged anxiety.
The doctor had noticed that several business owners seemed particularly stressed, with symptoms consistent with people facing significant external pressure. Some had mentioned sleep problems, others complained of headaches and digestive issues that often accompanied prolonged anxiety. "What can we do?" the doctor asked. "If we're right about these people being criminals, going to our local police might not be safe." "I've been thinking about that," Aida replied. "We need to contact state or federal authorities, but we need solid evidence first, and we need to be very careful about who we trust." She showed Dr. Santos some of her documentation, photos, financial records, and timelines of suspicious activities. The doctor was impressed by the thoroughness of Aida's investigation and her professional approach to gathering evidence. "You're still a journalist at heart," Dr. Santos observed. This is exactly the kind of work that can save our town. But it's also dangerous work, especially if these people are as connected to organized crime as you suspect. Together, they began planning how to safely gather more evidence and identify other community members who could be trusted to help. They agreed to meet regularly under the cover of routine medical consultations, giving them a way to share information without attracting attention. Dr. Santos also provided valuable insights into the psychological aspects of the criminal takeover. She explained how criminal organizations typically used intimidation and corruption to break down community resistance, and how important it was to maintain hope and solidarity among people who wanted to fight back. Communities are stronger than individuals, she said, but only if people are willing to work together and support each other. What these criminals are counting on is that people will be too afraid or too isolated to resist effectively. With Dr. Santos's help, Aida gained access to additional information that revealed the true scope of the criminal operation. The doctor had noticed unusual medical insurance claims being filed for businesses that barely had any employees, suggesting another layer of fraud beyond the basic money laundering. These false claims were another method of moving money through the system, creating fake medical expenses to justify transferring funds from criminal accounts to legitimate healthcare providers, then extracting the money through various means. The insurance claims don't match the reality of these businesses, Dr. Santos explained, showing Aida paperwork from her clinic. Murphy's Diner filed claims for 15 employees, but I've never seen more than 3 people working there at any time. The old movie theater, which has been closed for years, somehow filed claims for 12 employees who supposedly needed occupational health screenings. Aida also discovered that the criminals were planning to expand their operations significantly within the next month. Documents she had photographed during one of Mayor Peterson's meetings showed plans for converting several buildings into front businesses for drug distribution and human trafficking operations. The timeline was accelerating. If she didn't act soon, Millbrook would become the center of a major criminal network that would be much harder to eliminate once fully established. She reached out to investigative contacts from her journalism days, people who worked with federal law enforcement agencies. Through encrypted communications and secure phone calls, she began sharing her evidence with FBI agents who specialized in organized crime and public corruption cases. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to the bookstore owner, was part of a federal task force that investigated organized crime infiltration of rural communities. She had worked similar cases in other states and was immediately interested in Aida's evidence. "What you're describing matches patterns we've seen elsewhere," Agent Chen said during a secure phone call. Rural communities are increasingly targeted because they offer less oversight and fewer resources for law enforcement response. But the evidence you've gathered is exactly what we need to build a federal case. However, she warned that federal investigations took time, and Millbrook didn't have weeks or months to wait.
The criminals were moving quickly to finalize their control of the town, and any delay might allow them to complete their takeover before law enforcement could intervene. "We need to balance the need for a thorough investigation with the urgency of stopping these people before they become entrenched," Agent Chen explained. "Your evidence gives us grounds for immediate action, but we also need to ensure we can build a case that will hold up in court and capture the entire network." The crisis came to a head when Mayor Peterson announced a special town council meeting to vote on the development proposals. The vote was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and Peterson was confident he had enough support to approve the criminals' plans. The announcement came with only 5 days' notice, barely meeting the legal requirements for public notification. This rushed timeline was clearly designed to prevent organized opposition from developing and to minimize community input on decisions that would fundamentally change Millbrook's future. Aida realized this was her last chance to expose the truth before the criminal organization gained legal control of key properties in Millbrook. Once they had official approval from the town council, they could accelerate their operations and make it much harder for law enforcement to intervene. She spent the entire night preparing a presentation that documented everything she had discovered: the money laundering schemes, the corruption of local officials, the planned expansion of criminal activities, and the connections to organized crime networks in other states. But she knew that simply presenting evidence at the meeting wouldn't be enough. The criminals would deny everything, claim that evidence was fabricated, and use their influence with corrupted officials to dismiss her accusations. They might even use the meeting as an opportunity to escalate their intimidation tactics against her and other potential opponents. She needed a different approach, one that would expose the truth in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or covered up. Working with Dr. Santos and her contacts in federal law enforcement, she developed a plan that would maximize the impact of her revelation while minimizing the risk to herself and other community members who opposed the criminal takeover. The plan required precise timing and careful coordination, but it offered the best chance of saving Millbrook from becoming a criminal stronghold. On the day of the town council meeting, Aida contacted Rebecca Martinez, a reporter friend from her journalism days who worked for the state's largest newspaper. She provided all her evidence and requested immediate investigation and coverage of the story. Rebecca had worked with Aida on several international stories and trusted her judgment completely. When Aida explained the situation in Millbrook, Rebecca immediately understood the significance and agreed to provide media coverage that would make it much harder for the criminals to operate in secret. "This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told," Rebecca said. "Rural crime networks are becoming a major problem, but they don't get much media attention because they operate in places where there aren't many reporters. Your investigation could expose a pattern that's happening in communities across the country." Aida also sent copies of her documentation to the State Attorney General's office and the FBI field office, marking them urgent and requesting immediate action. Agent Chen had prepared her federal colleagues to receive this evidence and act on it quickly. Then she did something that would have been impossible in her war correspondent days. She organized the honest people of Millbrook to attend the town council meeting in large numbers. Dr. Santos spread the word through her medical practice, telling patients that important decisions were being made about the town's future and encouraging them to participate in local government. She was careful not to reveal specific details about the criminal investigation, but she emphasized that citizens needed to pay attention to what was happening. Sarah Chen contacted everyone who had ever bought books from her store, using her customer list to reach people who cared about the community's intellectual and cultural life. She organized a community reading group that would discuss civic engagement and local government, providing a natural reason for people to gather and learn about the issues. Tom Bradley reached out to his customers and suppliers, using his business relationships to build awareness about the meeting. Hardware store customers included many of the town's contractors, farmers, and small business owners, people with deep stakes in the community's future. Other resistant business owners talked to their families and friends, creating a network of informed citizens who understood that something important was happening even if they didn't know all the details. By evening, the usually half-empty town council chamber was packed with concerned citizens. Many people had never attended a council meeting before, but they came because trusted community members had asked them to pay attention to decisions that would affect everyone. The large turnout clearly surprised Mayor Peterson and the criminals who had expected to conduct their business with minimal public scrutiny. Mayor Peterson seemed surprised by the large turnout, but proceeded with the meeting as planned. He called the session to order and began with routine business: approval of previous meeting minutes, budget updates, and other mundane administrative matters that typically constituted the entirety of Millbrook Town Council meetings. The criminals were present, but tried to remain inconspicuous, sitting in the back of the room and avoiding eye contact with citizens they might have previously approached about selling properties or businesses. When Peterson reached the development proposals on the agenda, He presented them in glowing terms, emphasizing jobs and economic growth while avoiding specific details about the companies involved or their previous projects. These development opportunities represent exactly what Millbrook needs to secure our economic future, he said, reading from prepared notes. The developers have extensive experience in rural community development and are prepared to invest significant capital in our downtown revitalization. He spoke about job creation, increased tax revenue, and opportunities for young people to find work in their hometown instead of leaving for larger cities. The presentation was polished and persuasive, clearly prepared by people with experience in public relations and community outreach. When he called for questions, several citizens raised concerns about preserving the town's character, protecting existing businesses, and ensuring that development benefited current residents rather than outside interests. Peterson and the development representatives provided smooth answers that sounded reasonable but avoided committing to specific protections for local interests. Then Ada stood up. Mayor Peterson, before we vote on these proposals, I think the citizens of Millbrook deserve to know the truth about who we're dealing with. She had prepared carefully for this moment. Instead of making accusations that could be denied or dismissed, she asked specific questions that forced Peterson and the strangers present to reveal inconsistencies in their stories. Can you tell us exactly what types of businesses will operate in these new developments? The lead development representative, who introduced himself as James Morrison, provided a vague answer about mixed-use commercial and residential opportunities that would complement existing community assets. Why are the ownership documents for several local businesses already changed when the development plans haven't been approved yet? This question caused visible discomfort among the development team. Morrison claimed that some property owners had chosen to work with development partners in preparation for potential projects, but his explanation was clearly improvised and unconvincing. Can you explain why similar development companies with the same principles have been investigated for money laundering in other states? At this point, Morrison and his associates exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't expected to face informed questioning. They asked for more specific information about these investigations, claiming they weren't familiar with any legal issues involving their companies. With each question, the audience became more concerned and more engaged. People who had never participated in local government were suddenly paying close attention to details about property ownership, business operations, and legal compliance. When Peterson tried to dismiss her questions as baseless suspicions, Ada presented her evidence methodically. She had organized everything into a clear, compelling presentation that even people without investigative experience could understand. She showed photos of secret meetings, documented unusual financial transactions, and explained how the proposed developments matched patterns used by criminal organizations in other communities. Her presentation was factual, well-organized, and devastating in its implications. Over the past 3 months, 6 businesses in Millbrook have changed ownership to companies that exist only on paper, she explained, displaying copies of public records. These same companies are showing revenue levels that are impossible given the actual customer base of these businesses. She presented evidence of the suspicious financial transactions, the corruption of local officials, and the intimidation tactics used against business owners who refused to cooperate with the criminal organization. The audience's mood shifted from confusion to anger as they realized how close their town had come to being taken over by organized crime. People who had lived in Millbrook for decades were learning that their trusted officials had been compromised, and that their community was being systematically infiltrated by criminals. Several town council members who had been pressured to support the developments now openly questioned Peterson's judgment and demanded answers about his meetings with the strangers. Councilwoman Susan Miller, who had remained silent during previous discussions, now spoke up about pressure she had received to vote for the proposals without asking questions. I was told that opposing these developments would hurt the town's economic prospects, she said. But now I'm wondering whether the people telling me this had the town's best interests in mind. The strangers themselves remained silent during Aida's presentation, but their body language suggested they were calculating how to minimize damage to their operation. They occasionally whispered among themselves and checked their phones, possibly communicating with associates outside the meeting. Morrison attempted to regain control of the narrative by dismissing Aida's evidence as misunderstandings and coincidences. Ms. Martinez appears to have misinterpreted routine business activities, he said smoothly. Real estate development always involves complex financial arrangements that might seem unusual to people unfamiliar with the industry. But his explanations rang hollow in the face of Aida's detailed documentation. She had anticipated these denials and prepared specific responses that highlighted the criminal nature of the activities she had observed.
Mr. Morrison, can you explain why your company paid $300,000 cash for Murphy's Diner, which was assessed at $85,000 for tax purposes? And why that same diner is now reporting monthly revenues of $50,000 when it serves maybe 50 customers per day at an average ticket of $15? The mathematical impossibility of the reported revenue was obvious to everyone in the room. Even accounting for every possible source of legitimate income, Murphy's Diner couldn't generate anywhere near the money being claimed in tax filings. Morrison's response was evasive and contradictory, further undermining his credibility with the audience. Several citizens began asking their own questions, creating a dynamic that the criminals clearly hadn't anticipated. As the meeting continued and tensions escalated, state police officers entered the chamber. Aida's contacts in law enforcement had acted quickly on her evidence, and warrants had been issued for several of the criminals present. Agent Sarah Chen led a team of FBI agents into the room, immediately taking control of the situation with professional efficiency. The federal agents were already familiar with some of the suspects from investigations in other states, and Aida's documentation had provided the missing pieces needed to connect criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions. James Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and racketeering, Agent Chen announced. You have the right to remain silent. The arrest warrants were extensive, covering not only the obvious criminals, but also several local officials who had accepted bribes to facilitate the criminal operation.
Mayor Peterson was also arrested, along with Police Chief Williams and Building Inspector Hayes. The charges included conspiracy, bribery, and abuse of public office. The audience watched in stunned silence as people they had trusted were led away in handcuffs. For many residents, this was their first direct encounter with serious criminal activity, and the reality that their own officials had been corrupted was deeply shocking. Dr. Santos stood up and addressed the crowd. I know this is frightening and confusing, but we need to remember that our community is stronger than the people who tried to exploit it. We have work to do to rebuild trust and ensure this never happens again. Her words helped calm the situation and reminded people that they still had a responsibility to govern their community responsibly.
In the hours following the arrests, Millbrook began the difficult process of understanding what had happened and planning how to move forward. Emergency meetings were called to address immediate governance needs, and state officials arrived to provide oversight during the transition period. The state attorney general's office appointed a temporary administrator to handle essential town functions while new elections were organized. The goal was to maintain basic services while ensuring that any remaining corruption was identified and eliminated. Aida found herself at the center of media attention as news of the arrests spread beyond Millbrook. Her investigative work had not only exposed a criminal conspiracy in one small town, but had also provided law enforcement with evidence that led to arrests in 3 other states where similar operations were underway. National news networks picked up the story, presenting it as an example of how organized crime was adapting to target rural communities that lacked the resources to detect and resist sophisticated criminal operations. This case demonstrates the importance of citizen vigilance and professional journalism, said Attorney General Patricia Williams during a press conference. Ms. Martinez's investigation prevented Millbrook from becoming the center of a criminal network that could have operated for years without detection. But Aida downplayed her role when interviewed by reporters, emphasizing instead the importance of community engagement and the courage shown by citizens who were willing to stand up to intimidation. "I just used the skills I learned as a journalist," she told a reporter from CNN. But the real heroes were the citizens of Millbrook who stood up for their community when they learned the truth. Democracy works when people participate in it. The FBI investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the criminal operation that had targeted Millbrook. The organization had planned to use the town as a regional hub for drug distribution, money laundering, and human trafficking, taking advantage of its location near major transportation routes and its small law enforcement presence. Financial records seized during the arrests showed that the criminals had already moved more than $2 million through Millbrook businesses, and they were planning to expand their operations to handle 10 times that amount within a year. The investigation also revealed connections to criminal organizations in Mexico, Canada, and several other states, making this a truly international operation that used small American towns as cover for large-scale illegal activities. Dr. Santos was elected as interim mayor by the remaining uncorrupted members of the town council, and she immediately began implementing reforms designed to prevent future corruption. New procedures required public disclosure of all meetings between officials and outside parties, and all significant business proposals had to be reviewed by citizen committees before being considered by the council. "Transparency is our best defense against corruption," Dr. Santos explained during her first public address as mayor. "When government operates in secret, it creates opportunities for people with bad intentions to manipulate the system." Several legitimate development companies approached Millbrook with proposals for economic development, but these were evaluated through the new transparent processes that included extensive community input and independent verification of the company's backgrounds and track records. The criminal organization's failed attempt to take over Millbrook had an unexpected positive result. The town received significant attention from legitimate developers and government programs designed to help small communities grow economically. The story of Millbrook's resistance to organized crime attracted positive media coverage that highlighted the community's character and resilience. This attention brought tourists, new residents, and businesses that wanted to be part of a community that had demonstrated its commitment to honest governance and citizen engagement. For Aida, the experience had been both challenging and transformative. She had discovered that her journalism skills were just as valuable in a small town as they had been in war zones. Perhaps more valuable because she was protecting her own community rather than just reporting on distant conflicts. The investigation had also reconnected her with the sense of purpose that had originally drawn her to journalism. Instead of feeling like she was running away from her past as a war correspondent, she now understood that she was applying those same skills to protect people who had become her neighbors and friends. She continued working as a delivery driver, but now she also wrote articles for the local newspaper about local government and community issues. The Millbrook Gazette had been a struggling weekly publication, but increased community interest in local affairs following the crisis provided an opportunity to expand coverage and readership. The combination of delivery work and journalism gave her both financial stability and the opportunity to use her investigative abilities to serve her community on an ongoing basis. "I've learned that heroism isn't about seeking adventure or recognition," she told a journalism student who interviewed her for a college project. "It's about using whatever skills you have to help your community when help is needed." That's something anyone can do, regardless of their background or profession. The experience had also taught her something important about the nature of home and belonging. She had spent years as a war correspondent, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to develop deep community connections. But in Millbrook, she had found something she hadn't expected. A place where her skills and experience could make a lasting positive difference in people's lives. The attempted criminal takeover of Millbrook led to changes that extended far beyond the town's borders. State legislators passed new laws requiring greater transparency in property purchases and local government dealings, particularly in small communities that lacked resources for sophisticated oversight. Training programs were established to help small-town officials recognize and resist corruption, and new funding was provided for rural law enforcement agencies to deal with organized crime infiltration. Aida was invited to speak at conferences about investigative journalism and community activism. She shared her story not as someone seeking recognition, but as an example of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they combined awareness with action. Every community has people with skills and experience that can help protect against threats, she told audiences at these conferences. The key is recognizing that citizenship involves more than just voting every few years. It means staying informed, asking questions, and being willing to act when something threatens the community's well-being. Her presentations emphasized practical steps that communities could take to protect themselves, establishing transparent processes for government decision-making, encouraging citizen participation in local affairs, and creating networks of communication that could quickly share information about suspicious activities. The criminal organization that had targeted Millbrook was eventually prosecuted using evidence from multiple states. Several members received lengthy prison sentences, and their assets were seized to compensate communities they had harmed. The prosecutions also disrupted similar operations in other rural areas as federal law enforcement agencies used intelligence gathered from the Millbrook investigation to identify and shut down criminal networks across the region. In Millbrook itself, the crisis had brought people together in ways that lasted long after the immediate danger passed. Citizens were more engaged in local government, more supportive of local businesses, and more aware of their collective power to protect their community. The town council meetings that had once attracted only a handful of residents now regularly drew 30 or 40 people interested in participating in local governance. New committees were formed to address various community needs, and volunteer organizations expanded their activities to include civic education and community organizing. Dr. Santos proved to be an effective mayor, combining medical training's emphasis on evidence-based decision-making with genuine commitment to community service. Under her leadership, Millbrook implemented innovative approaches to citizen engagement and transparent governance that became models for other small towns. The town created a citizen review board that examined all significant proposals affecting the community, ensuring that residents had meaningful input into decisions that would affect their lives. They also established regular forums where citizens could ask questions about government operations and receive detailed answers from officials.
Sarah Chen expanded her bookstore to include a community meeting space where residents could gather to discuss local issues and organize civic activities. The bookstore became an unofficial community center where people shared information and coordinated efforts to improve their town. Tom Bradley's hardware store became a networking hub for local contractors and business owners who wanted to ensure that future development benefited existing residents rather than outside interests. The business community that had been fragmented and competitive before the crisis now worked together to promote sustainable growth. The experience had demonstrated that small communities possessed significant power to protect themselves when citizens were informed, engaged, and willing to work together. But it had also shown how vulnerable these communities could be when residents became complacent or when civic engagement declined. Democracy requires maintenance, Dr. Santos often said during her public addresses. It's not something you can set up once and expect to work automatically. Every generation has to recommit to the principles and practices that make democratic governance possible. 2 years after the crisis, Millbrook had become a model for other small communities facing similar challenges. The town's story was studied in criminology classes and cited in research about how criminal organizations target rural areas. Academic researchers visited Millbrook to study the community's response to the criminal infiltration and to document the changes that had been implemented to prevent future problems. Their research contributed to policy recommendations that were adopted by state and federal agencies responsible for rural development and public safety. But for the people who lived there, Millbrook was simply home, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, and where ordinary people could become heroes when circumstances required it. The town had also attracted new residents who were drawn by the community's demonstrated commitment to honest governance and citizen engagement. Young families moved to Millbrook because they wanted to raise children in a place where democracy was practiced actively rather than just talked about occasionally. Small businesses thrived in the supportive environment that emerged after the crisis as residents made conscious decisions to support local enterprises that contributed to community well-being. The economic development that had been promised by the criminals was actually achieved through legitimate means that benefited existing residents rather than outside interests. Aida continued her dual life as delivery driver and citizen journalist, finding satisfaction in both roles. She had learned that heroism wasn't about seeking adventure or recognition, but about using your abilities to serve your community when they were needed most. Her story became a reminder that in an interconnected world, the skills and experiences people gained in one context could be invaluable in completely different situations. A war correspondent's training in investigation and documentation had proved perfect for fighting organized crime in a peaceful small town. 3 years after the crisis, Millbrook established a community college branch campus that offered courses in journalism, criminal justice, and public administration. Aida was hired as a part-time instructor, teaching investigative journalism and media ethics to students from across the region. Her classes attracted students who were interested in using journalism to serve their communities rather than seeking fame or career advancement in major media markets. Many of her students came from small towns that faced challenges similar to what Millbrook had experienced. Journalism is a public service, she told her students during the first class of each semester. Your job as a journalist is to help your community make informed decisions by providing accurate, thorough information about issues that affect people's lives. She taught practical skills, how to research public records, how to conduct interviews with people who might be reluctant to talk, how to verify information from multiple sources, and how to present complex information in ways that ordinary citizens could understand and use. But she also emphasized the ethical responsibilities that came with journalism skills, the obligation to be fair and accurate, the importance of protecting sources and respecting privacy, and the need to consider how reporting might affect the people and communities being covered. Her students produced a community newspaper that covered local government meetings, investigated issues affecting rural communities, and provided information that helped citizens participate more effectively in democratic processes. Several of her students went on to work for newspapers and television stations in other small towns, carrying with them the lessons they had learned about journalism as community service rather than personal advancement. The success of Millbrook's response to organized crime inspired the creation of regional networks that connected small towns facing similar challenges. These networks shared information about suspicious activities, coordinated responses to potential threats, and provided support for communities that needed help dealing with criminal infiltration. Aida served on the steering committee for the Regional Rural Safety Network, which included law enforcement officials, elected leaders, business owners, and citizens from dozens of small towns across 3 states. The network had prevented several attempted criminal takeovers by identifying patterns early and coordinating rapid responses that involved both law enforcement and community organizing. The key was recognizing that criminal organizations relied on secrecy and isolation to succeed, and that communication and cooperation between communities could disrupt their operations. Criminal organizations count on small towns being isolated from each other and from resources that could help them resist, explained Agent Sarah Chen, who had continued working with rural communities on organized crime prevention. When communities work together and share information, they become much harder targets. The network also worked to address the underlying vulnerabilities that made small towns attractive to criminal organizations: economic desperation, declining populations, and reduced government services that created opportunities for criminals to fill gaps in legitimate institutions. By promoting legitimate economic development, supporting local businesses, and strengthening democratic institutions, the network helped communities build resilience against criminal infiltration while also improving quality of life for residents. 5 years after the crisis, Aida received the National Community Journalism Award for her role in exposing the criminal conspiracy and for her ongoing work to strengthen local media and civic engagement in rural communities. The award ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., and attended by journalists, government officials, and community leaders from across the country. In her acceptance speech, Aida emphasized the importance of local journalism and citizen engagement in maintaining democratic institutions. "Democracy doesn't happen automatically," she told the audience. "It requires people who are willing to pay attention, ask questions, and act when action is needed. That's true whether you're a professional journalist or just a citizen who cares about your community." She used the platform to advocate for increased support for local journalism, particularly in rural areas where professional media coverage was often limited or non-existent. She also called for civic education programs that would help citizens understand their role in democratic governance and provide them with skills needed to participate effectively. The recognition brought additional attention to Millbrook's story and to the broader issues affecting rural communities. Several foundation grants were established to support local journalism and civic engagement initiatives in small towns, and university research programs began studying the relationship between media coverage and democratic participation in rural areas.
But Aida remained focused on local work rather than seeking national prominence. She returned to Millbrook after the ceremony and continued her regular routine of delivering packages and teaching journalism classes, finding satisfaction in the daily work of serving her community. As she made her daily rounds through Millbrook's familiar streets, Aida often reflected on how much her life had changed since those dangerous days when criminals threatened her community. She had found something she hadn't expected when she left journalism: a way to be both ordinary and heroic at the same time. The packages in her delivery van contained the simple necessities of daily life: medical supplies for Dr. Santos's expanded clinic, books for Sarah's thriving bookstore, tools for Tom's hardware business that now served customers from several surrounding towns. But they also represented something more: the continuing life of a community that had faced down organized crime and chosen to build something better in its place. Her apartment above the coffee shop remained simple, but now the walls held photos of her journalism students, newspaper clippings about successful community organizing efforts, and letters from people in other towns who had been inspired by Millbrook's story. She had learned that heroism came in many forms, and that the most important kind might be the quiet, daily work of paying attention to your community and acting when action was needed. Not everyone could be a war correspondent or conduct dramatic investigations, but everyone could participate in the ongoing work of democratic citizenship. Her war correspondent days had taught her to recognize threats and gather evidence under dangerous conditions. But her years in Millbrook had taught her something equally important: how to use those skills not just to report on problems, but to solve them through community action and civic engagement. "I thought I was retiring from journalism when I came to Millbrook," she told a visiting researcher who was studying the town's transformation. "But I learned that journalism isn't just a profession, it's a way of approaching citizenship. The skills are the same whether you're covering a war or protecting your hometown from criminals." 10 years after the crisis, Millbrook had become a symbol of rural resilience and effective democratic governance. The town was featured in textbooks about community organizing and studied by researchers interested in how small communities could protect themselves from external threats while promoting internal development. But the changes went beyond symbolic importance. The community college campus had expanded to offer 4-year degrees in several subjects, providing educational opportunities that kept young people in the area, instead of forcing them to leave for larger cities. Local businesses had thrived under the supportive policies implemented after the crisis, and several new enterprises had been established by residents who wanted to contribute to the community's economic development. The downtown area that criminals had planned to exploit for illegal activities now hosted restaurants, shops, and service businesses that employed local residents and served community needs. The citizen engagement initiatives that had emerged from the crisis continued to evolve and expand. Monthly town halls provided regular opportunities for residents to participate in governance, and community committees addressed issues ranging from economic development to environmental protection to education policy. Aida had been re-elected to the Citizen Oversight Committee multiple times, and she also served on the Community College Advisory Board and the Regional Journalism Education Consortium. Her work had evolved from emergency response to ongoing institution building, helping to create structures that would protect and serve the community for generations. Her journalism classes had produced dozens of graduates who worked for local newspapers, radio stations, and online publications throughout the region. Many of them focused on covering local government and community issues, continuing the tradition of journalism as community service that Aida had modeled. "The best journalism happens when reporters understand that they're part of the communities they cover," she told new students each semester. "You're not just observing and reporting. You're helping your community make better decisions by providing the information people need to participate effectively in democratic governance." 15 years after the crisis that had brought organized crime to Millbrook's doorstep, Aida Martinez was still delivering packages throughout the town. But now she also served as director of the Regional Center for Community Journalism at Millbrook Community College. The center trained journalists from across the country in techniques for covering rural communities and supporting democratic participation in small towns. It also provided resources for communities that wanted to strengthen local media coverage and citizen engagement. Her story had become part of local legend, but Aida preferred to focus on the present and future rather than past accomplishments. Each day brought new opportunities to serve her community, whether through her delivery route, her teaching, her writing, or her participation in the ongoing work of democratic governance. She had discovered that heroism wasn't a single dramatic act, but a way of approaching life, staying alert to problems, using your skills to help others, and believing that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they work together. In her office at the community college, surrounded by journalism awards, photos of her students, and thank you letters from communities that had been helped by graduates of her programs, Aida often thought about the lesson her experience had taught her. That the most important stories weren't always the ones that made headlines, but the ones that made communities stronger. The delivery van still sat parked outside her apartment each morning, ready for another day of connecting people through the simple act of bringing them what they needed. But it also represented something larger, the idea that anyone, at any age, in any circumstances, could become the hero their community needed. Her war correspondent days had been exciting and important, full of dramatic events and international significance. But her years in Millbrook had taught her that some of the most important work happened quietly, in small places, through the accumulated actions of people who cared enough to pay attention and act when action was needed. Ida Martinez had proved that heroism wasn't about cape-wearing super people or dramatic rescues in exotic locations. Sometimes it was just about a former war correspondent turned delivery driver who noticed that something was wrong in her town and decided to do something about it. That was a story worth living, one delivery at a time, one student at a time, one community meeting at a time. In a world that often celebrated fame and fortune, Ada had found something more valuable: the satisfaction of using her skills to serve her neighbors and protect the place she called home. As she prepared for another day of deliveries and classes, she reflected on the words she often shared with her students. The best stories are the ones that help people live better lives. And the best way to find those stories is to pay attention to the place where you live and the people who live there with you. The community college's journalism program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a small initiative to train local reporters had evolved into a nationally recognized program that attracted students from across the country. These young journalists came to Millbrook not just to learn technical skills, but to understand journalism as a form of community service. Among her most promising students was Maria Rodriguez, a young woman from a farming family who had grown up watching her parents struggle with economic pressures and government policies that seemed designed for urban areas rather than rural communities. Maria possessed the same combination of curiosity and determination that had driven Ada's own career, along with a deep understanding of rural life that came from lived experience. I want to tell stories that help farming families navigate the challenges they face, Maria explained during one of their weekly mentoring sessions. Too much agricultural journalism is written by people who have never lived on a farm or understood what it means to depend on weather and markets for your survival. Another standout student was David Chen, Sarah's nephew, who had returned to Millbrook after completing a degree in computer science at a major university. He was developing innovative ways to use digital media and social networking to strengthen community connections and improve local government transparency. Small towns often get left behind by technological advances, David explained, while demonstrating a community engagement app he was developing. But technology can actually help rural communities stay connected and participate more effectively in democratic processes, if it's designed with their specific needs in mind. These students represented the future that Ada had hoped to help create. Young people who combined professional skills with genuine commitment to serving their communities. They understood that success wasn't just about personal advancement, but about using their abilities to strengthen the places and people they cared about. The journalism program also attracted older students who wanted to change careers or develop new skills for community service. Retired teachers, small business owners, and even former law enforcement officers enrolled in classes to learn how to better serve their communities through media and communication. The success of Millbrook's transformation had attracted attention from researchers, policymakers, and community organizers around the world. Delegations visited from other countries to study how a small American town had successfully resisted organized crime infiltration and built stronger democratic institutions. Dr. Santos, now in her second term as mayor, regularly spoke at international conferences about rural governance and community resilience. Her presentations emphasized practical strategies that communities could implement regardless of their size or resources. Democracy isn't just about elections, she told an audience at a United Nations conference on rural development. It's about creating systems that allow ordinary citizens to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect their lives. That requires transparency, accessibility, and ongoing commitment to civic education and engagement. The town had also become a testing ground for new approaches to rural economic development that prioritized community ownership and environmental sustainability over short-term profits. Several pilot programs funded by federal agencies and private foundations were evaluating innovative strategies for helping small towns thrive in changing economic conditions. These programs attracted young entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses that served community needs rather than just generating maximum profits. The local business district now included a cooperative grocery store, a community-owned broadband internet service, and several worker-owned enterprises that provided good jobs while keeping ownership and profits within the community. Aida served on the advisory boards for several of these initiatives, bringing her investigative skills and community knowledge to help evaluate proposals and ensure that new projects truly benefited local residents. Her role had evolved from emergency responder to institutional builder, helping create structures that would protect and serve the community for decades to come. On a quiet Sunday morning in late spring, Aida celebrated her 60th birthday with a small gathering of friends and colleagues at Sarah's bookstore. The celebration was simple but meaningful, reflecting the values she had come to embrace during her years in Millbrook. The gathered friends represented the community she had helped build and protect. Dr. Santos, now a close friend and trusted colleague; Sarah Chen, whose bookstore had become a center for intellectual and cultural life; Tom Bradley, whose hardware store continued to serve as an informal meeting place for community organizers; and several of her journalism students, now working as reporters and editors throughout the region. "I never expected to find a second career as a teacher," Aida reflected during the informal celebration. "But working with young journalists has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Seeing them develop skills and commitment to community service gives me hope for the future of both journalism and democracy." The birthday celebration also marked another milestone: the publication of Aida's memoir, Small Town, Big Story: A Journalist's Journey from War Zones to Main Street. The book combined her personal story with practical guidance for citizens and journalists interested in strengthening their communities. Publishers had been interested in sensationalizing the criminal conspiracy and her role in exposing it, but Aida insisted on a more thoughtful approach that emphasized the broader lessons about civic engagement and community resilience. The book included detailed appendices with resources for citizens who wanted to become more involved in local government, and for communities that wanted to strengthen their resistance to corruption and outside manipulation. "My story isn't really about me," she explained to a book reviewer who had expected more dramatic personal revelations. "It's about what ordinary people can accomplish when they pay attention to their communities and act on what they observe. That's a story that applies to every town and every citizen, not just to one former war correspondent who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Despite Millbrook's success in building stronger institutions and community resilience, new challenges continued to emerge that required ongoing vigilance and adaptation. Climate change was affecting local agriculture, creating economic pressures that could make communities vulnerable to outside exploitation. Demographic changes as older residents aged and younger people sometimes moved away for education or career opportunities required new strategies for maintaining community continuity. The opioid crisis that had devastated many rural communities had largely bypassed Millbrook, partly because of the strong social connections and economic opportunities that had been developed after the criminal conspiracy was exposed. But community leaders remained alert to signs that drug trafficking or addiction problems might emerge, and they had developed prevention and response strategies based on lessons learned from other communities. Technology presented both opportunities and challenges. Digital communication tools made it easier for citizens to stay informed and participate in community governance, but they also created new vulnerabilities to misinformation and outside manipulation. Ada's journalism classes now included extensive coverage of digital literacy and critical thinking skills needed to navigate increasingly complex information environments. Every generation faces threats to their communities, she told her students during a discussion about contemporary challenges. The specific threats change, but the fundamental skills remain the same: paying attention, asking questions, verifying information, and working with neighbors to protect what you value. The Regional Center for Community Journalism continued to evolve its programs to address these emerging challenges. New courses covered climate journalism, rural economics, and digital security for small communities. The center also developed partnerships with universities and research institutions to study how rural communities could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining their character and values. Epilogue: Legacy and Continuation. 20 years after the crisis that had brought organized crime to Millbrook's doorstep, Ada Martinez reflected on the journey that had transformed both her life and her community. The delivery van had been replaced by a newer model, and her hair was now completely gray, but she continued the daily work of serving her neighbors and teaching the next generation of community journalists. The morning sun painted Millbrook streets in golden light, just as it had on that day 20 years ago when she first noticed something wasn't quite right. But now those streets belonged to a community that had learned to protect itself, to value truth over convenience, and to understand that democracy required the active participation of ordinary citizens who were willing to be heroes when heroism was needed. Her apartment above the coffee shop now contained a small library of books written by her former students, newspaper clippings documenting successful community organizing efforts throughout the region, and photographs of the dozens of young journalists who had carried lessons learned in Millbrook to communities across the country and around the world. The story of Millbrook had become more than just one town's resistance to criminal infiltration. It had become a model for how communities could build resilience, strengthen democratic institutions, and create opportunities for citizens to use their skills and knowledge in service of their neighbors. That, Ada knew, was the most important story of all. And it was a story that continued every day in the actions of people who understood that protecting their community was everyone's responsibility, that democracy required constant maintenance, and that ordinary citizens possessed extraordinary power when they chose to use it wisely and courageously. As she prepared for another day of deliveries and classes, surrounded by the quiet bustle of a community going about its daily business, Ada smiled at the thought that heroism had turned out to be exactly what she had found in Millbrook. Not dramatic rescues or international recognition, but the steady, ongoing work of paying attention, caring for neighbors, and building something better together, one day at a time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.